Hi, my name is Liz Dunn. I am a property owner and landlord on Capitol Hill in Seattle. I mostly focus on repurposing older commercial buildings. Sometimes I build new buildings in the missing teeth between older buildings. And I think properties that I've developed over the last 20 years that people might be familiar with are Melrose Market, which is on Melrose between Pike and Pine Street, and the complex that we call Chop House Row, which is a collection of buildings further up the hill between East Pike and East Union Street and 11th and 12th, where we have 6 buildings of our own plus a couple of neighboring buildings that all sort of hinge around a central courtyard that is private but open to the public, meaning everyone is welcome. There's a fire pit and a piano and now a Christmas tree back there as of today. So that's what I do. And our spaces are very much focused on providing opportunities for small locally owned businesses to do what they do: restaurants, cafes, retailers, salons, barbershops, gyms. I'm a landlord on Capitol Hill, and I have been for about 20 years. So I live very much in the world of small, locally owned business, because that's the kind of real estate that I have owned and have always wanted to own. I try to preserve and remodel, repurpose old buildings, and then use them to create space for small, interesting, locally owned businesses. So needless to say, COVID has been incredibly impactful. I have probably 25 ground floor businesses, so customer facing businesses that have been impacted, are in categories that have been impacted by the government mandated shutdowns, and also just the lack of foot traffic and customer activity since March. It seems like a long time now. And I remember thinking back in April, well, okay, we'll take a bunch of tactical measures to try to offset the impacts to these tenants, and hopefully by summer we'll be back on track. And here we are, and it's almost the 1st of December. So I don't think any of us expected this crisis to be as protracted and impactful as it has been. And I am far less willing now than I was then to make predictions about when we might come out of it. So it's really hard. My primary concern is for my tenants. These are family-owned businesses, so my fear is that I'm watching generational wealth get wiped out, meaning that, over half of my ground floor businesses are owned by or co-owned by people of color or women or LGBTQ members of the community, or all of the above. And I think that reflects the community on Capitol Hill. And also, I would like to think my attitude as a landlord around what makes for a vibrant and successful community. But many of these folks are immigrants, or so they're 2nd or 3rd generation restaurant owners. But in other cases, they're entrepreneurs who have just, been in business for 5 or 10 or 15 years. And it is so hard to be a small business owner at the best of times that it is painful to watch them have to deal with really what feels like the worst of times. Now, of course, this impacts me as well as a landlord, because I have mortgages on these properties. And so the only way that I am able to provide rent relief to my tenants, and I've been fortunate that I've been able to do so, has been specifically by asking for mortgage relief from my lenders. That has only been possible, I think, because my banks are also locally owned, local or regional banks who know my assets really well, meaning they know the properties really well and they understand the nature of these tenants. And those are really personal relationships that I've worked hard on over the years. So thank goodness I'm not dealing with a bank on the other side of the country who has no idea who these tenants are or what these properties are about. You know, I think this is an interesting time because even those of us who would describe ourselves as optimistic, glass half full people are being challenged in our beliefs. Listen, again, I'm more concerned about my tenants. I'll be okay. I make a mean spreadsheet. I was a pretty good bartender in high school. If everything ends up going from bad to worse, I'll find something to do. My parents still have a guest room. And so, you know, I mean, at a run up to Thanksgiving, we are all encouraged to think about the things that we are grateful for. And that also helps feed optimism, because if you can enumerate the things that you are grateful for, or the things that are still going okay, then I think you can build from there. I hope that my tenants are able to maintain optimism, because I do have to believe that by next summer, things will feel, not that they're completely normal or better, but that they are on a path to normal and better. But again, I make predictions like that very cautiously now. I think one story that is not getting told, so I will highlight that, is the plight of small landlords. And I'm not saying that for myself because I've been fortunate with my banking relationships. I think that there are thousands of small landlords out there who are not as fortunate with their banking relationships. And I don't believe there's been enough of a spotlight on that. I think that there are small landlords with real estate loans going bad as we speak. And again, those are family owned real estate businesses. We're not talking about the big guys. We're talking about families who own small commercial buildings, small multifamily buildings. That's also generational wealth that's getting eviscerated. And I wish policymakers would work with banks to address that problem more directly. Economies are ecosystems. Our local economy is part of a much bigger regional, state, and federal economy. And I think that my concern is that it's not understand that by definition, it's an ecosystem, that all the pieces are linked, and that you have to understand that whole ecosystem in order to figure out all the places in that ecosystem where assistance is going to be needed in order for things to not just completely fall apart. I am also concerned that the policy moves around public health, you know, 8 months into this crisis, we're not matched with economic policy that we've really had 8 months to figure out. And it was understandable that when we shut down in March, that we had to take some rapid steps from a public health perspective and maybe then figure out the economic piece of it. I'm a little disappointed now with policymakers at every level in this country that they were not better prepared for this second shutdown. And I think the economic consequences are going to be far worse as a result. I have watched my own tenants reinvent their businesses. I mean, not just once, but in some cases twice or three times over the last 8 months. And I have been so impressed with how creative, innovative they've been, and then just how hard they've worked. And I mean, obviously it matters because this is their entire livelihood is on the line, But at the same time, I think it would be somewhat easy to sort of throw up your hands and say, this is all too much. And I haven't seen a single one of the small business owners that I know give up, you know. And so I suppose that indirectly gives me hope for our economy when I see how hard small business owners and entrepreneurs work and will continue to work. Yeah, it's been a really good year to think about that harder than I ever have before. Now, I will say that I've been in real estate for 20 years, and so I've been very involved in community for 20 years because I approached that initially from the perspective that the two go hand in hand, and I wish that more people in real estate did approach it that way. My business wouldn't be successful if I wasn't extraordinarily embedded in the community, and have served on a number of boards like Capitol Hill Housing, which is now Community Roots Housing, the Pike Pine Neighborhood Coalition. I'm currently on the board of the Downtown Seattle Association, and I learn as much from those experiences and get as much out of those relationships as they get from me. And I feel like I am therefore fortunate that I've been aware for some time that on issues of racial injustice, you can't just acknowledge that those injustices exist. You better be part of the solution. If you're not part of the solution, then you actually are part of the problem. And that's probably been my biggest piece of learning over the years, from really getting embedded in community and listening to what people have to say on that point. And so I think that more people, especially in the world of business, are understanding that in a way that they didn't before. So I'm quite hopeful about that. But I do think that there's still a substantial portion of our population, you know, nationwide, maybe not so much in Seattle, but still people who were paying a lot of attention in May and June and have since gone back to feeling fairly complacent, like there's nothing that they individually need to be doing. And, you know, you have to be careful with your friends and family and colleagues. You don't want to sound too pedantic about this, but when I talk with friends and colleagues about this, I have an action plan. I did have an action plan, but I have a better, more ambitious action plan now than I did before. Meaning I have a personal agenda for how I think I can push the ball forward. And I want every one of my friends and colleagues to have an action plan too. And I think that's still the hurdle we need to overcome. I think there are lots of people out there who still don't think that they need to have an action plan. They don't think it really affects them. And I would argue it affects everybody. It really does. And I feel like there was a moment where we all understood that. And I'm worried we're going to lose that moment again, where people don't understand that, no, it affects everybody in our society, the impacts of racial inequities. I honestly believe that Seattle has been hamstrung for a long time by the fact that our state is a very low tax state and a very regressive tax system. And I think Seattle bears the brunt of that more so than other communities around the state, because we deal with a lot of the impacts of social inequities, racial inequities, homelessness, the need for better mental health and other wraparound social services. The city of Seattle deals with all of those issues more intensely than the East Side or even King County suburbs, and certainly other parts of the state. And yet it is a statewide issue. And, you know, as a result, we have passed a Seattle-specific payroll tax, which I understand what the sentiment was, that led city council to want to do that, but I think it's misguided for one city to pass a tax that puts it at a disadvantage relative to the cities immediately adjacent to it. And we therefore run the risk, and we're already seeing this, of companies that are still able to invest in office space or move their business are moving. I mean, we've had lots of announcements by big tech companies about what they're going to be doing on the east side. And the worst case scenario that I see coming out of that is that Seattle ends up being the place that where concentrated poverty, where these issues get concentrated. And I mean, we have to deal with these issues. These are issues of social and income and racial inequity, but where they get concentrated in Seattle because all the players who want to avoid dealing with those issues move to other parts of the state. So I am a huge fan of the idea that our state tax system needs to be restructured. We collect not enough tax, and the tax we collect from the wrong people. Sales tax and property tax are incredibly regressive. They hit the poor and middle class disproportionately. And right now our tax sources are obviously collapsing because our poor and middle classes are collapsing under the weight of COVID. So I think this may be a turning point. I guess what I would hope is that maybe this will be the moment where as a state we have that conversation, and where Seattle can drop its Seattle only tax in favor of joining a larger coalition of people around the state. And I think there is a growing, don't know if it's a silent majority, but I think it's a pretty strong minority, even at the highest levels of business, who would like to see a more equitable statewide tax structure. I don't think Seattle's going to be able to lead on its own. Again, I think it only works if it's part of a regional solution. I don't think a city in the context of a region like ours on its own is going to be able to be an example for the rest of the nation. But I think our region could be an example for the rest of the nation. Like, I look at the work that's being done by Challenge Seattle, which is really a regional effort, even though it's called Challenge Seattle, because it's the top 20 CEOs from our regional employers, led by Christine Gregoire. It was interesting that they felt the need to come out last week with a statement directed at the governor about what we need to be doing, not just in terms of a COVID response, which was sort of the immediate part of that message, but what we need to be doing long-term in terms of investments in education, transit, and indirectly climate. In the same time frame, like literally in the last week, the Cascade Innovation Corridor folks, and there is some overlap, an interesting overlap, not coincidental, between the Challenge Seattle group and the Cascade Innovation Corridor group, where they were pointing out that the future of our state really requires nodes of density up and down what is now the I-5 corridor and what we hope will be a high-speed rail corridor that connects Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, BC in a sort of supercharged, technology-driven economic region. And so if I'm resisting the question a little bit about what Seattle can do, it's because I have a very strong belief in this larger regional solution as being the model for how we need to move forward. I actually think Seattle on its own shouldn't be trying to lead anything. It should be, I wish our current city council were more interested in engaging in those regional efforts. I mean, I do spend a lot of time talking to, CEO friends, people who have companies in these downtown high rises that they're not occupying at the moment, and what they think is going to happen, because it really all depends on how people work. I will say, and you're going to get a lot of different points of view on this, personally believe the city is not dead, that the experience of graduating from college and going to work for a company still involves getting to meet your colleagues face to face, collaborate with them, brainstorm with them, You know, I don't think anyone under 30 really wants to work from home. Unless and I'm going to say something. I was a programmer in my early days. So I'm allowed to say this because I fell in this category. Unless you're a pretty technology focused personality that likes to be alone in their room all day writing code anyway. And for sure that makes up some portion of our technology worker population. But generally speaking, I don't think anyone in that younger employee category with a professional degree really wants to work from home. And then there's, of course, huge numbers of people who can't work from home because that's not, their job doesn't even allow them to do that. They're not office workers. They're in different industries or doing different activities. So I am hopeful that it is the younger generation that is going to drive us back into the office. I do think that what we may see, and I don't think this would be a terrible thing, is that smaller cities from this point on, more manageable size cities, grow faster than big cities. And I think that's the idea even behind what the Cascade Innovation Corridor folks are thinking, is that it may be that Seattle doesn't need any more skyscrapers than we already have, but that it would be great if there was a better job base in Bellingham, even Everett, Olympia, you know, that these smaller cities, and I mean, I read these real estate reports all the time. Salt Lake City's on fire, Boise's on fire, Missoula's on fire. What people like about those cities, the people who are choosing to move there, and that's what I mean by on fire, they are becoming hotspots for technology companies and for people who just, as residents, want to get out of a larger city. They have all the amenities of a big city, but they also have super great access to ski hills and mountain bike trails, all of those things that are just outside the edges of those small cities. And yet they still have international airports. You can still get to other places. So I think we are entering the era of this, what we used to call second tier city, of the small city kind of coming into its own. You know, I did a master's degree in urban planning, and I remember having a conversation about, is there a size where a city is too big? Like, is there an optimal size? It was a very theoretical academic conversation, but there was absolutely no answer. But maybe we're about to answer that. Maybe we are about to find that our big cities have hit their functional limit, and people don't necessarily want to live in the middle of the sticks, but if they can work remotely, they have the choice of moving to a different small city, a different smaller city. What you really want to do is see every community of a certain size participate in the solution to homelessness, and not put all the formerly unsheltered people in one neighborhood, in one city, because it's not particularly great for them or for anybody else. We have something like 11,000 unsheltered folks in King County right now, I think. And I wouldn't want to see all those folks sheltered, you know, in 4 square blocks of downtown, you know, former office buildings. Now, on the other hand, I think as a community, we're understanding that there's a substantial portion of that population that would really benefit from wraparound services, which we have been terrible at providing up until now. I mean, Plymouth Housing does a great job, and that's kind of the model that needs to be propagated. But I'd like to see it propagated in a less concentrated way, because I think it would be better for those residents. And I think we all have to take responsibility. I am appalled by how people really just don't want to have to see the problem. You know, again, it comes down to, you have to want to be part of the solution as well. And, you know, I think Paul Lambros from Plymouth Housing, I don't want to put words in his mouth, would say that they can get economies of scale on wraparound services at 200 to 300 units. And that seems like an appropriate size to try and embed in a diverse, income diverse community. I started my career here in Seattle 33 years ago as a college student working for Microsoft. And I say that because I don't want you to think that my answer is going to be biased um, when I tell you who I've admired most in the last year. So I worked for Bill Gates, and that was an interesting and challenging relationship for everybody who worked there at the time. It was a small company. We worked hard. We challenged each other's ideas in quite assertive ways. And I'm super grateful for the time that I spent there, sort of my formative years. But there were things about Bill's management style that he today would say were not in the rearview mirror, potentially as ideal or humane or even productive as they could have been. And I really feel like he has come so far as a leader, and to see him in the last year trying to give people encouragement and hope, trying to stay as apolitical as possible while being an authoritative voice in the room, trying to be a source of untainted information. I just, there's just been moments where I was so grateful for where he has landed in his life, because I think it's been so helpful to us. And, and then just the further challenge that he has faced of these crazy conspiracy theories, lodged against him, because he's been trying to be a source of just clear and untainted information. So I've admired his evolution as a person and a leader, and I've admired specifically the role he's played in the last year. Locally, I've been kind of disappointed by our leadership. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because I was just trying to think who I think has done a good job in a leadership role. And it's been a lot of disappointment for me. There's been a lot of finger pointing. There's been a lot of political posturing without a lot of practical, humane solutions. I think my heroes are my tenants. Again, I will just go back to the people I've been most impressed with over the last year are the business owners who refuse to throw in the towel and who are keeping their businesses alive by whatever means possible. I think my biggest takeaway from this year really is how fragile a democracy can be, even a democracy that thinks it's the shining example for the rest of the world and is rock solid. I have been shocked at how fragile it has turned out to be. Maybe there's hope in here somewhere, because having exposed that fragility, we can now all work to shore it up for the future. I think there was a headline in the New York Times in the last couple of days that said, okay, we've stress tested our election system, and now we know where the cracks are. A more serious issue that I don't really know what the lesson is or what the solution is how the culture divide in our country is driving the polarization politically. And so I have some optimism that Joe Biden, while he was not my favorite candidate back in the primaries, might actually be the right guy to pull this country together. I also think that the left is just as guilty as the right of being hysterical and having blinders on. And as a country, every single one of us needs to be looking for the middle. And what I don't mean by that we don't want to keep making radical progress on issues of social and racial inequity. That's not what I mean. But I think culturally and politically, we need to be looking for a middle. Like, we all have to really feel compelled to find a middle path for this country, or things are going to get worse instead of better. As a Canadian, I probably have a unique perspective on this, and Canada's democracy isn't perfect, but most people in Canada are driving in the middle lane. I think when I moved here 35 years ago, that was true in America as well. I've wondered for a long time, and this may, again, I'm not a technical person anymore, so this may be a naive suggestion. I don't know why it is allowable to publish something that's untrue on the internet. I mean, I understand First Amendment rights, but I don't think that they extend to blatant misinformation and falsehoods. And so I think whatever technology is going to emerge out of this, it needs to be some kind of truthometer, because if we're not all operating from the same set of data, facts, then how can we expect to reach any compromise or consensus? And so I literally think it's going to have to do with truth in publishing, truth. Journalists have always been held to that standard, and I think that individuals publishing on platforms like Facebook may need to be held to that same standard, and that the platforms are going to have to implement some technology to make that happen. Again, maybe that's a naive suggestion, but I think that may be the only way to fix this. I think one thing I'm going to do differently in the future is don't sweat the small stuff. Keep my eye on the fundamentals of my business, of my tenant businesses. Certainly in real estate, there is a tendency to be over optimistic. And, in Seattle, the market has been frothy in commercial real estate for a long time. I mean, I'm lucky. I'm not implying that I have made any crazy, rash decisions in the past, but I also think that there is fundamental learning when there's a major economic shock like this. And to be fair, this is the third major economic shock I've lived through since I became, a property owner, a landlord, a real estate person. The first was 9/11, and when I was in the middle of building my first project. The second was obviously, 2008, and the years that followed, and this is the third. And maybe this time my understanding is a little deeper about how fragile even a really strong regional economy can be. I am very optimistic about Seattle's prospects over the long term, but I think this has been a huge lesson in how even the most attractive place with lots of talented people can really be brought to its knees by an economic shock like this. And also, interestingly, can therefore maybe better see the social and racial inequities that those go-go years were obscuring. I feel like it's maybe not a coincidence that COVID kind of brought us to our knees economically, and then other events shone a light on our social and racial inequities within our community in a way that might not have resonated as profoundly if they'd happened at a different time, when everyone was hard at work trying to earn that last dollar or get that next deal. I'm extremely concerned about climate change, but I'm going to first and foremost say that I think that if I think about myself in the context of Washington State, which is the state where I live and the state that I love, it's about taxation. I don't want to see another survey that shows that we are 49th out of 50th out of 50 states in per capita education spending. I don't want to see another chart that shows we're 47th out of 50 in mental health spending. I don't want to see another newspaper story about how we have the most regressive tax system, meaning that our poorest people are paying the vast majority of our taxes. I expect more out of the community, the portion of the community that can afford to pay more. So I just think that we can do better as a state on that front, and that would be hugely impactful for all of the other things that we are trying to deal with. You know, it's hard to talk about climate change if people don't have jobs. So I believe we need to take radical and rapid action on climate change, but it's got to be built on a foundation, an economic foundation that is already taking care of our most vulnerable people. And you know, some of the solutions to climate change will also provide economic growth and jobs, but not if people aren't trained for those jobs. So I think the underpinnings of our state in that regard, education in particular, are very shaky and need to be shored up in order for us to be able to tackle climate change in a way that is economically rigorous. I would love in 5 years if the more than 10,000 unsheltered people in King County were sheltered and sheltered in places that they felt gave them the support that they needed to get on with their lives, whether that's permanent supportive services or just for all those families that fell out of housing in the last 10 years to get back into housing so that then they can go back to being employed. I just feel so strongly that we have a responsibility as a state to tackle that. So I'm hoping in 5 years we've made significant progress. I feel like we may finally be on the verge of making significant progress. So that's why I say in 5 years, maybe we will, things may look significantly different. I would love if our state tax system had been restructured to be more equitable and to generate more revenue so that we can better educate the kids who grow up in our state, so that the University of Washington isn't constantly having to pull students from out of state because the ones in our own state aren't qualified coming out of high school. I would love to see high-speed rail become a reality. That's not going to happen in 5 years, but it would be nice if we had pushed the ball a little further on that. I've been personally involved in an effort over the last several years to put a lid over the freeway as it runs through our urban areas. Not just Seattle. I mean, the issue exists up and down our state in the I-5 corridor and in other corridors, but we ruined our cities and created a lot of navigation and pollution issues when we put those highways through. And I think we know a lot more now than we did in the 1950s and 60s. And we could put a lot of people to work creating beautiful green infrastructure in those locations. I would love for there to just be a better supply of affordable housing. Jobs are great, but not if they make housing so unaffordable that we create a class system of haves and have-nots, you know, tech workers and everybody else. I want Boeing to figure out how to fly airplanes on something other than jet fuel. I'd love for them to do it here. So I want Boeing to stay here, and I want them to take the radical step way before Airbus of figuring out how to put airplanes in the air. with something other than jet fuel. I want to see them really be an innovator. So how's that for a laundry list? I'm sure there's more. I just can't think of it. I think that we have a pretty radically left city council that doesn't really understand where our wealth has come from. You know, they're making the valid point that not enough of it has been used to help solve our social and racial inequities, but they seem very ill-equipped to understand what middle lane solutions might look like. And you know, the problem is that's a turnoff for CEOs of companies and wealthier folks, or just suburban folks or single family neighborhoods that don't want to see tents on their sidewalks. And so, well, I am frustrated that there's a class of people who just doesn't want to see the tents but doesn't really want to solve the problem. There's a class of people that wants to solve the problem but has completely unrealistic ideas about how to solve it. I joined the Downtown Seattle Association board somewhat reluctantly, only because I don't live downtown. But they really wanted a Capitol Hill perspective, and I appreciated that, so I agreed to do it. I've been impressed with the leadership there. They, I think, are really committed to trying to find that middle road. And it's interesting that it's institutions like that, and I'm not saying that the DSA are the only ones doing good work in that regard right now, that normally you would hope that would come out of the mayor's office or out of elected officials. And I feel like these days I have far more confidence in institutions, organizations like the DSA to try and find that middle road, or challenge Seattle to find that middle road. Even the chamber, I think I've always found to be a bit too conservatively defensive of big business. Even here locally, I think is understanding that they need a far greater number of diverse voices in their ranks, and I've been impressed at their efforts around that the last couple of years. And so I think I literally am kind of looking to organizations like that to try and find the middle road, to bring our more traditional conservative business interests into the middle, have a conversation about tax reform amongst many other things, and to bring the unrealistic expectations of this sort of far activist left into the middle road too, in terms of what's practical. What are people going to agree to? Rome wasn't built in a day. You know, you can be anti-capitalist only for so long before the money runs out. You know, you got to find a balance. We've got to generate cash, and then we have to distribute it more fairly. But being anti-capitalist is not a solution. Is not a solutions-oriented approach in my view. So, yeah. So I'm somewhat optimistic that these are the institutions that have the people, have that middle lane practical understanding of things,